Greetings, literature lovers. Today we are going to talk about American literary history, just a glimpse of it, starting with Native American period, that is 20,000 BC to the present. The characteristics of the literature is as diverse as the cultures that created it, but there are often common elements such as stories explaining creation or natural forces and narratives, myths, legends, songs, and narratives were passed down in an oral tradition. Next comes the exploration period, 1492 to 1607. Characteristics: the literature is composed of European writings that describe the explorers' travels and impressions of the continent and its native people. The literature of this period comes to us in the form of letters and journals written by explorers as well as Native American tribal leaders. Next comes is the colonial period, that is 1607 to 1765, and the colonial period was dominated by Puritan beliefs, and thus literature of this period is usually historical, religious, and didactic. The first slave narratives were written at this time. Imaginative literature was rare in some colonies and it was banned for being immoral. The literature of this period comes to us in the form of tracts, polemics, journals, narratives, sermons, and some poetry. Next is Revolutionary period, and it's from 1765 to 1790. The Revolutionary period usually refers to writings that are politically motivated, either in support of British rule, in support of American patriotism and independence, or relating to the Constitution. The writing at this time is dominated by political documents, speeches, and letters. 1750 to 1800 is also known as the period of enlightenment because there is a lack of emphasis and dependence on the Bible and more use of common sense, logic, and science. And there was not a divorce from the Bible but an addition to or expanding of the truths found there. Next is the Romantic period, also called American Renaissance, that is 1828 to 1865. This period was the first major exposition of a distinctly American body of literature. Many of the American literature's most well-known writers emerged during this time, and Romanticism was a literary and artistic movement of the 19th century that aroused in reaction against 18th century neoclassicism and placed a premium on fancy imagination, emotion, nature, individuality, and exotica. Next is Age of Transcendentalism, 1863 to 1836 to 1860. Transcendentalism was an American literary and philosophical movement of the 19th century. The Transcendentalists, who were based in New England, believed that intuition and individual conscience transcend experience and thus are better guides to truth than are the senses and logical reason. Influenced by Romanticism, the Transcendentalists respected the individual spirit and the natural world, believing that divinity was present everywhere in nature and in each person. Transcendentalists and fireside poets, that is, Hawthorne and Melville, rebelled against the philosophy that man is basically good. The third group, the fireside poets, wrote about more practical aspects of life, such as dying and patriotism. Next, talking about is realism, 1865 to 1900. And the post-Civil War period was an era of increased industrialization and urbanization as the national attempted to nation attempted to recover emotionally, culturally, and politically from the aftermath of the war. Though there were still elements of romanticism, this period was considered realistic in its emphasis on unidealized and truthful depictions. Next is Naturalism, 1900 to 1914. The literature is composed of European writings that describe the explorer's travel and impressions of the continent and its native people. Next is the modern period, that is 1914 to 1939, a period in British and American literature spanning the years between World War First and Second, and works in this period reflect the changing social, political, and cultural climate and are diverse, experimental, and non-traditional. An age of disillusionment and confusion. Just look at what was happening in history in the US during these dates. The period brought us perhaps best writers. The author during this period raised all the great questions of life but offered no answers. Imagism, that is 1912 to 27. Imagism was a literary movement that flourished between 1912 and 1927, led by Ezra Pound and Amy Lowell. The Imagist poets rejected 19th century and poetic forms and language. Instead, they wrote short poems that used ordinary language and first verse to create sharp, exact, concentrated pictures. There's also beat writers, that is belonging to 1950s. Beat writers' writing was generally anti-traditional, anti-establishment, and anti-intellectual. Prominent writers in poetry were Allen Ginsberg's Howl, Lawrence Ferlinghett's prose, and Gertrude Stein, T.S. Eliot, and novels by William and Jack Kerouac. Next is the Harlem Renaissance, 1920s to 30s. It was the first major burgeoning of visual and literary and performing arts by African Americans concerned with African Americans' life, art, culture, and politics. The influence of the Harlem Renaissance remained strong for the remainder of the 20th century. And last is the Lost Generation, belonging in 1920s. After World War I, a group of American writers grew increasingly disillusioned by and resistant to what they saw as hypocrisy in dominant American ideology and culture. Many of these writers left America in search of a more artistic life in London or Paris. Thank you.